Hey everyone, it's me, DB. Just reminding you, we have t-shirts in the shop. Just go to pgttcm.com. Check out all of our cool t-shirts and stickers. Heck, we even got some shelf curtains in there. Keep clean, look cool, have cool stickers to put on stuff. Join us on Patreon, get a free sticker. Or don't. It's up to you.
You're listening to KZOM, Oleander Public Radio.
Greetings, listeners. It is I, DB Spitzer and Farmer Dave, here once again to talk to you about the Cthulhu mythos, its books, its monsters, its unfortunate human casualties, its timeline in general, and even its tangential bits, like the dreamlands or things of a weird nature that are Lovecraftian leaning. Once more we head into those dark woods, further feeling those malevolent forces upon us. Once again we walk down the lightless stone staircase in the middle of nowhere.
You're listening to KZOM.
Hello everyone, it is me, DB Spitzer, and across from me, virtually, is of course Farmer Dave. Farmer Dave, how the heck are you doing this week?
I am virtually well.
Virtually well, that's good to hear.
And I am excited about what we are going to be talking about today.
Yeah, what's that?
We are talking about not Arthur Conan Doyle, not Conan the detective, not the redhead Conan talk show person.
Boo.
We are talking about Conan the Barbarian.
Conan the Barbarian! So we're going to be talking about Conan. I was thinking maybe we could cover a couple of topics, but then Conan came up and I'm like, you know, Randolph Carter gets his own episode, and Randolph Carter's only in a couple short stories. Conan was a serious character in a lot of stories that, you know, not a lot of people went, you know, let me write some Randolph Carter fan fiction. You know, there's not people fighting over copyright of Randolph Carter. But
Ralph agrees with you. Ralph definitely agrees with you there. And I think there were actually only 12 or so Robert E. Howard Conan short stories.
Sure, yeah.
If you look, you'll get about 40, because a lot of them are going to be later published after his death. Mm-hmm. They're going to be story ideas that he had for different characters that are going to be. But I think there were originally like 12 stories and an unpublished novel.
Well, according to Wikipedia, there are 17 originals, weird tales, and then there was one in Fantasy Fan Magazine, and several not published within his lifetime, and several like unfinished stories in general that had like just really cool names like The Hall of the Dead and The Hand of Nurgle, The Snout in the Dark. Well, The Snout in the Dark, that doesn't sound too terrible.
Yes. Now, what a lot of people don't know about this is that Robert E. Howard created 2 Conan characters.
Yeah.
And I sort of see this, you know, Lovecraft was an atheist.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, you know, he was like the perfect atheist.
Uh-huh.
Howard really believed in reincarnation.
Okay.
And we see that. And we see that in what I read as the first Conan story.
Yeah. And
it turned out it's not Conan the Barbarian. It was a different Conan. And that's The People of the Dark. And again, it's a 90-year-old story, but it's one of his best stories. And we're going to spoil it for you if you haven't. That's the official Ralph the Rooster spoiler warning.
Spoiler alert, everyone.
Yes. So in this story, and I'm not exactly sure when it's published, but I think that this is autobiographical in some extent, maybe not, but I think this is after he discovered that Novelyn Price was dating someone else.
Okay.
And that the main character which is again, I don't think it's ever named. I think it's the almighty I narrator.
Yeah.
Chases, follows his girlfriend and her beau into the dragon caves.
Ooh.
And he's gonna kill him. But then, and there he's in somewhere in the United Kingdom. I think it's Scotland or Ireland. I think it's actually the original Conan was Howard liked to think of himself as genetically Black Irish.
Mm-hmm.
And so as they go into this cave, he gets possessed by the ancestor Conan.
Yeah.
Who is then attacked by these aborigines, which are not Australian aborigines. These are these missing links, half human, half animals. And it brings back the spirit of his ancestor Conan, who fought these. And so he goes after these missing link aborigines, as opposed to going after his lover who's cheating on him.
Yeah.
And so that I read that before I read any of what we now call sort of the Conan the Barbarian series. And the term, I mean, the Conan Barbarian is pretty much created as a concern for the comic books.
Yeah.
But so the character we call Conan the Barbarian, I thought this was an actual Conan the Barbarian, but it was a different Conan character.
Gotcha. Okay.
So he kind of takes this character though, and I, like I said, Howard really, really believed in reincarnation. And so I kind of think of this as sort of as one sort of version of Conan ends.
Yeah.
It gets reborn in another version.
Okay.
And the next version is going to be, and we discussed this a little bit last week,
Okay.
really is going to be King Cole.
Okay. Yeah.
And for those of you who are not familiar, it's not King Cole the Merry Soul, it's King Cole, Kull. And where...
Kill with a U.
Yes, exactly. And that maybe would be what he was thinking when he said that. And so he has this idea. He wants to take this character from slave to king.
Yeah.
But after about 3 stories, he kind of writes himself in a corner. So that we talked about last week, he went around basically traveled the Texas-Mexican border until he had written basically the history of this continent, that he would have Conan travel all around sort of in a big giant spiral and end up as king.
Yeah.
So, I would say a proto version of Conan is King Cole.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of King Cole's stories are going to be changed by Len Carter and DeCamp, and we'll go into them more, I'm sure, into Conan stories.
Yeah.
But one of the most interesting, I think, Cole facts is that the character played by James Earl Jones in the Conan movie, that's not a Conan character. That's a King Cole character.
Cool.
Yeah, so Doom is a Conan character. And then when they make a King Cole movie with Kevin Sorbo, they use not a King Cole story, they use a Conan story. So Hollywood pretty much sees King Cole and Conan as the same. And then, you wrote in... and he sort of ends, too. He kind of Howard sort of ends the stories. He has this idea where he wants it to go, and when he's finished, he has Conan disappear. But, he goes off. But he kind of ends the story as far as Howard is concerned.
Yeah.
And he did get an offer to write a novel, and it never quite comes through. And this is sort of, I think, the beginning of course, Conan the Barbarian. before we go into other versions, was there something that you wanted to share about the character at this time, or?
Oh, goodness. I wanted to say my personal exposure to Conan was watching the movie as a kid. And being like 7 or 8 and watching Conan in my living room on VHS, and just going, oh wow, is there more stuff like this? Like, I want to say that Conan the Barbarian is honestly kind of the entryway for me. It was like Conan the Barbarian, and then my dad going, oh yeah, sure, let me show you this movie called Lord of the Rings, and there's another movie called The Hobbit, the animated movies.
And the animated version.
Yeah, from the 70s. And, luckily our video store had those movies. And, then I found out that I liked fantasy, because it wasn't really that kind of like of a mainstream easy thing to get in the early 80s. I want to say it's like fantasy. It wasn't like there was like the only fantasy on television in the early 80s was Fantasy Island and Love Boat crossover episodes. There wasn't like a lot of like science fiction. It's like the science fiction that I remember in the early 80s is like the A-Team. Honestly, in some of their solutions felt like science fiction to me. But I didn't feel like there was like a lot of like representation of fantasy, especially like Sword and Sandal or like Middle Earth style medieval fantasy kind of stuff, really. Maybe the closest thing that I had at that point in time was like Conan the Barbarian and Star Wars, but yeah.
And if it was cheesy Italian swords and sorcery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That generally, like, my parents wouldn't necessarily let me watch because there was a lot of boobs in it, or just like really cheap gore effects. And I remember like seeing pilots for shows that were kind of like Conan-esque, but you'd only ever see the pilot, and then it would be gone. And there was never anything. And then that, and I don't know. I want to say thank goodness for basic cable coming into an existence and getting things like Xena and Hercules, which eventually led the way to a Conan TV show, good or bad. At least it existed.
No, absolutely. And the Conan cartoons, and these are, again, I think, other reincarnations of Conan. But Conan is not the character that made Howard the most amount of money.
Oh, interesting. I know you've probably told me this fact before, but whom is it?
So the most amount of money, he was very successful towards we died with a character called Breckenridge Elkins. Which was basically cowboy comedy.
Okay.
So it's sort of like, think of Jethro Bodine and the Beverly Hillbillies. Yeah. But make him dumber and stronger. And he was basically this sort of good old boy that wasn't very smart, that would always get into fights, but somehow dumb luck would just save him.
Gotcha.
And the cutest girl, the girl in the village liked him, but he was making pretty decent money towards the end of his life. So he made more money, with the Breckenridge Elkins stories than he made with the Conan. But Conan is his enduring legacy. And even after he dies, it's still kept. And then I think the really next after Howard's death is the thing that really sort of reincarnated Conan the Next is the Lancer books.
Okay.
And so the Lancer were Ellsberg de Camp and Lynn Carter. Okay. Basically re-edited the Conan stories. Okay. Added new ones. And so Ellsberg de Camp is kind of going to be the August Derleth of the Robert E. Howard story, and that he's gonna take much more credit. He's basically going to, make as much claim, say these are my stories as much as they were Howard's.
Yeah.
And let history speak. I don't think there's really anyone really like DeCamp's version better, but he did preserve it.
Yeah.
He did progress it. He did increase the market. And one of the things that I think really helped the Lancer were the covers.
Okay.
By Frazetta.
Yeah.
And these are these covers with this huge barbarian and the barbarian and that scantily clad women. And it kind of gets us this concept that is even carried on now to 5e D&D.
Yeah. That
Conan didn't wear armor.
Which is false. Which is super false.
Exactly. He reads whatever appropriate armor. The reason why, though, Frazetta didn't like drawing armor.
Yeah.
So he thought that it was boring compared to body tone.
Yeah.
And so no matter what it is, he would basically do Conan shirtless. And that's where we get this idea that the shirtless Conan, or sort of reincarnated again.
Yeah.
It really, really did sell books.
Yeah.
It sold a lot of books. I remember, being like 10 and seeing a copy of one of the Conan Lancer paperbacks in the kids section of my public library. I was looking at the cover. That's a kid's book? I was like, But, say what you want about the camp. He did get the name and the character out there.
Sure.
Ready for its next major reincarnation, which is the Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
Now, so Marvel Comics is basically connected with Roy Thomas. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Roy Thomas, he was basically Stan Lee's right-hand man, or at least that's what he claimed. And there was this pull. So Marvel decided, for marketing reasons, maybe we need to expand so that we are not so stuck on, if superheroes fold, we've got other markets.
Yeah.
And so they had a vote, and it was Lord of the Rings, Conan, I believe Frad and the Grey Mauser, and I believe it was Doc Savage.
Okay, all right.
And so there's votes. Who do you want to be the most to get their monthly comic? And Conan just beat everybody else combined. Just tore apart, Lord of the Rings, everyone else. So Stan Lee goes, well, okay, this is going to be our next comic. And so he basically goes to Roy Thomas, and he says, I want you to make this comic book. And Roy did not know anything about Conan per se. He had read the first book, and he wasn't that impressed. But he had read a DeCamp version. So he really starts digging through, and especially what we talked a little bit about last week. We started going through, the history of Hyboria, and he starts adding to the Conan myth. He basically reincarnates Conan again, and a lot of what we see. So this is the first time we see Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
It's marketed because all the previous books, they picked that title because all the Lancer books, all the complicated, they had Conan the Pirate, Conan the King, Conan the Freebooter, Conan, this, but they didn't have a book Conan the Barbarian. That's why they chose to title it Conan. And this is the time that we are going to see the creation of Red Sonja.
Yeah.
We're going to see a lot of sort of things. A lot of these will be retelling of stories, but a lot of it would be new stuff that they would create. And this is also going to be get ready. I don't think if there wasn't the Lancer books, there wouldn't have been the comic books.
Yeah.
If there wasn't the comic books, there wouldn't have been the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that is where most people first heard about. Well, most people of a certain age, is the first thing that they heard of Conan.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of ideas for the Conan movie, including that it was going to be after, like, World War III.
Okay, all right.
And fortunately, they decided to go with the movie that we have, where I think most people, I mean, even when I read like the original comic books, or I'm reading Robert E. Howard, it's hard for me not to give Conan an Austrian accent. And this I became this new reincarnation is in the movies.
Yeah.
And to be honest, there was a lot of wild ideas here. I forgot the sort of thief that hangs out with them. That was just some surfer dude. He had never been in a movie before.
Yeah.
They got Mako, and so it was sort of some very sort of radical things that was, you're absolutely right, different, that it sort of took Conan, but it took movies in a different way.
Oh yeah, there were so many Conan knockoffs after Conan came out. There were so many low-budget sword and sorcery movies. It was like someone makes a good science fiction movie, and then you have like a slew of movies that, it's like someone makes a movie that's like stands out in some way, and then everyone goes, oh, I can do that for really cheap. Okay, everyone, we're going to Italy. Everyone, we're going to Vietnam. Everyone, we're going to Nicaragua. We're gonna go film in the jungles of South America, and I have to say, that is one of my favorite aspects of Conan, is what it started for, just kind of like B movies, and like, I don't know. There's like, I feel like we wouldn't have like certain trauma films. We wouldn't have certain like Roger Corman films. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there were Sinbad films, and there was like Clash of the Titans and stuff like that. But in ways, it could not compare to Conan the Barbarian. There was this like darkness to Conan. There was like this edge, this like this anger, this sorry if anyone with earbuds, but
and it definitely, yes, it took fantasy movies in a way, and for the time, 82 that came out, it pushed the limits.
Mm-hmm.
It pushed the limits of an R-rated movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Definitely, actually, set Schwarzenegger on his path.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, it was a movie that it was a kingmaker in multiple ways. And then, like, what came after Conan the Barbarian besides opening up a genre to, like, the world to be aware of muscly people swinging around big chunks of metal in the ancient world or post-apocalyptic world?
So I think you're right. A lot of them are going to be, like Ator. They're going to be, the Warrior Queen. A lot of them are going to be ripoffs.
Mm-hmm.
There are, I believe, there were a few. I think Excalibur predates Conan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there were, some high fantasy, but it was mainly Arthurian.
Yeah.
It was mainly Simnad, and so here is, it is again sort of this person of the populace, the people. Conan starts out the king, or he doesn't start out the king. In this. The movie, he starts out as a slave,
mm-hmm.
and I think that's something else that sort of people like, especially. Yeah. And of course, also Doom was, by James Earl Jones was mm-hmm. just amazing.
Oh yeah. And not just a sword and sandal Darth Vader.
This is off. Yeah, this is a little off. But did you know that the first time that James Earl Jones met Carrie Fisher?
No.
Was in only once. They only met in person once.
Oh,
and that was in a 2014 filming of the Big Bang Theory that they both attended. They were both on the same episode. That is the only time they ever met each other in person.
Interesting.
Just a trivia fact I found this week that I thought I'd change.
Huh.
And of course, there's two official Conan movies
mm-hmm.
but there's kind of a third, which is Red Sonja.
Yeah.
Now Red Sonja with a J with a Y is created by Robert E. Howard.
Yeah.
Red Sonja with a J is written by Roy Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a separate trademark than Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
So, and when they did get around to the Red Sonja movie, they couldn't use Conan the Barbarian.
Mm-hmm.
They had to create another character.
Yeah.
And honestly, until I saw it, and I didn't see it until it was TV, I thought it was the third Conan movie.
Yeah. A lot of people I know have always treated it like, we know they couldn't say it was Conan, but that's Conan. You don't get Arnold Schwarzenegger to play a barbarian and it's not Conan. It's like, legally, we can't say this is Conan, but you all at home know this is Conan, is kind of how I felt about the movie as a kid, and I still feel that way, honestly.
And so there was definitely a lot, there was a Conan TV show.
Mm-hmm.
I like Marvel, and I like the Dark Horse. I love Dark Horse comics.
Mm-hmm.
I like their Conan stories, but, Marvel's taken everything back. And I like the sort of new reincarnation, which is basically just an old version, or trying to go back to old school comics,
yeah.
Conan. But what I don't think really succeeded was making Conan an Avenger.
Oh, one more time?
So he's not like Conan as an Avenger.
Oh, Conan as an Avenger. I did not ever hear about that.
So he's not the main Avenger roster,
Uh-huh,
but there's the Savage Avengers,
Good.
which has Punisher and Dr. Voodoo and a time-traveling Conan, and I think maybe Black Widow. And they did in fact, Marvel even brought back Roy Thomas to write a couple of episodes, and didn't miss a beat. As good as his other stuff.
Okay.
But when they're set in the Hyborian Age, but Conan as basically Thor without the necessarily, the comic code authority behavior.
Sure.
It just didn't work for me. And a lot of, I think, comic book fans, it didn't work for. So this, but yeah, so Conan was part of the Savage Avengers,
Gotcha.
and Conan time traveling and stopping a crime in Las Vegas. That reincarnation didn't work that well for me.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's any other incarnations of Conan that have come out within like the last 10 years that I'm aware of, and I am drawing a blank, except for video games.
So video games especially, and there was the Jason Momoa movie.
Oh. I missed that one somehow.
I didn't get through. Yeah. Momoa was fine. I mean, he was charismatic, but I didn't get through the movie.
Okay.
I was excited about it, but yeah, so about maybe 12 years ago, there was a new Conan movie. It just, it didn't quite work. But I think that is kind of the new thing. And one other version is other authors have bought. So Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series,
yeah,
he wrote his four Conan novels in the 80s.
That's cool.
And before he did the Wheel of Time. So there's definitely been quite a few reincarnations. But now my understanding is that the trademark is Conan is owned by a gaming company. And that's it. That they really want to. I think that's going to be the next real big incarnation.
Yeah.
Is Conan and video game characters.
Yeah. No, there's Conan Exiles. I remember playing on the PlayStation 4, and I remember being like, oh, this is a pretty cool game. Get to roll around Hyboria, build bases, build your crew and stuff. And it was an interesting game. But it just wasn't quite what I was looking for in a Conan game. I don't necessarily want to build little villages. That just I want to troubleshoot. I want to be a pirate. I want to be a barbarian. I want to be it's like I want to do all the crazy different things that Conan does. But yeah, no. Definitely, I think with like open world concept games, I know, Dave, that you don't play video games and you're just really good at running everyone into walls, but I definitely think a new next step in Conan story and evolution is definitely future could lie in video games as much as it does in comic books or in cinema. But I would be excited to see. Honestly, excited to see any kind of Conan game out there. Honestly, but whether it be role playing or I don't know, just a side-scrolling fighter.
And I think that really is going to be sort of the next reincarnation of Conan. It is going to be a very video-centric. Video game-centric.
Yeah.
And they're going to kind of build around that.
Sure. Definitely. All right. Well, everyone, who do we got with us for interview this week?
So we've got a really good interview, and we are going to be talking with Jason Stewart, and we're going to be talking about horror and Cthulhu, but also the 80s.
Cool. Nice. All right, so we'll do that, and then after that, Dave and I are going to talk about a specific incarnation of Conan. Conan in your RPG. All right, we'll see you all after the break.
The Shrink Next Door, only on Apple TV. A 2021 drama starring Will Ferrell and Paul Rudd, inspired by the true story of Marty and the therapist who turned his life around, then took it over. When we first meet Dr. Reich, Marty just wants to get better at boundaries. Over 30 years, he'll learn all about them and what happens when they're crossed. The Shrink Next Door, only on Apple TV. Look for the show notes for a link. Thank you once again for listening to People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. You can help show your support by going to the show notes and following any of the links that'll tell you how to support the show and how to support our guests. And thank you to all of our guests who you can find in the show notes. Rate, review, subscribe, and remember, patrons get priority access to asking us questions, suggesting topics, even, submitting stuff. Actually, you don't have to be a patron to submit anything. That's how Dave got on the show, and that's how you can get on the show too. It's the People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends. Thank you for listening. Back to the show.
So we are now talking with Jason Stewart. And Jason Stewart is an author, and he's going to talk about two things that I love: the Cthulhu Mythos and the 80s. And maybe some more. Jason, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Oh, sure thing. So my name's Jason Stewart, and I'm an author. I've been published for a little over 10 years now. A few short stories at first, and then my first novel, Raise a Holler, came out 10 years ago. And that was kind of a Southern adventure romp, sort of a Lord of the Rings, but set in the rural South in the 60s. And then I wrote a little bit in that vein for a few years, and then switched gears a few years back and decided to go in a completely different direction. And so my new work, my current project is a trilogy of, sort of all of the 1980s pop culture, sort of shoved, smashed, just sort of molded into one ball, like one linear 3-novel story. And the goal is as many Easter eggs as I can possibly shove into this thing.
I love Easter eggs.
Yeah, it's, like I said, I won't go into too many specifics on anything, sure. But, it's, we start with my main character, a high school girl, redhead named Molly. Bears no similarity or relation to any famous 80s redheads named Molly. So,
I can't think of any. I can't think of any Mollys and short redhead, right? Short red hair.
However you want to imagine it, sure. Yeah, I'd say somewhere in the shoulder length to above, maybe. But then, she has a crazy adventure while babysitting, and one thing goes wrong after another, and, fabulous secret powers are revealed to her one night, and then everything just sort of rolls downhill from there.
As happens.
Yeah, as happens. And then, in my head, even though it's a novel, in my head it's a musical set to an all 1980s soundtrack. And I even borrow song titles as chapter titles, which is not something, I'm not picking any new ground there. I've noticed a few people doing that over the years, so I just decided to borrow that same trope.
I love that. I thought I call it method writing by playing music in the background, and I thought I invented that, but almost every writer I ever talked to said, yeah, of course, Dave, we all do that.
Oh yeah, exactly. It isn't new. I've been borrowing songs and song titles for years. Every novel in this trilogy is a classic 80s song title. First one is Jukebox Hero. Second one is Hungry Like the Wolf. And the third one, which releases next month, is Rainbow in the Dark. So it's, I feel like the music really makes it. That was that was the most disappointing thing to me in the new Wonder Woman. They billed it as an 80s, pop culture thing, and then they had no music. It was strange.
Yeah. What do you think is some of the draw of the 80s? Why do you think the 80s are so popular now?
I do. I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is, guys like me, guys like us that live, our generation. Let me say, I shouldn't say guys.
Are you talking about my generation? Sorry,
yeah, I'm talking about my generation. So yeah, I think Gen X and even the older millennials that were around for most of it, and they definitely caught the reruns on cable in the 90s. Yeah. That music, that time, that aesthetic. We're now hitting middle age, and we're getting, we're starting that turn where we start to look backward a little more often than we look forward, unfortunately. So I think we're hitting those nostalgic years of our lives where we look back and we just want to listen to the old music, watch the old movies, play the old games, that sort of thing. And the other reason I think the 80s specifically is a big thing, more so I think than the two decades sandwiching it, 70s and the 90s. And I could be wrong about this, but I look back at the 20th century nostalgic decades, pop culture that really sort of had staying power. And you had the 1920s, that whole aesthetic, the bootleg, the prohibition, the flappers, fast cars.
The roaring 20s.
Yeah, the roaring 20s. That was a big thing. People talked about the roaring 20s for decades and decades and decades. And then, even more so than that, in terms of pop culture, I think if we had to draw a bullseye around what decade's aesthetic has been the biggest pop culture phenomenon, it's the 50s.
Yeah.
I mean, entire genres of movie, pop culture, music sort of draw on that sort of aesthetic of the 50s. You have
youth culture is pretty much invented then.
Yeah, rock and roll is essentially becomes the dominant force. Car culture, diners, and like I said, every town had a 50s diner for years. I think they still do. And here locally where I live, there's this big festival every October. They call it Cruising the Coast, and it's basically just a 10-day 50 extravaganza, and it's all these people, and a lot of these guys, the generation, the boomers, and even the generation prior to the boomers, they drive these classic cars down here, like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 cars driving up and down the beach for over a week. And it's a miracle to me that these things are still running. But yeah, every business turns into a 50 diner overnight.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's nothing but doo-wop and Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins and, blue suede shoes. And yeah, I think about that. And then along comes the 80s. And the 50s were really big in the 80s. Like, Back to the Future, one of the most iconic 80s movies, 80s trilogies. And yet it's really
exactly. Or, in the late 70s, early 80s, all my parents' friends were into Happy Days.
Yes, Happy Days. Perfect example. And that was what, a 70s show, right?
Yeah, I think it might have made it up to 80, but it was still enough that I lived in the LA market, so that they would still have like after school reruns of Happy Days.
Yep. I remember. Yeah, I caught the reruns myself too. Like I said, I was trying to remember if it bled all the way into the 80s or not. But my point is, I knew it was an anachronistic show. It wasn't an actual 50s show. It was a show about the 50s. And yeah, this iconic, how cool it was back then. And then interestingly, that same thing started to happen with the 80s in the 90s. And I'll say something really strange now. Adam Sandler, I think, was the trailblazer here.
How so?
He made The Wedding Singer in, I think, 1998. And he already saw that train coming. He says, no, this is going to be the next big, iconic, nostalgic decade. And he made The Wedding Singer, and the whole thing was just a big parody of the 80s. I mean, like an over the top parody of the 80s at that. He had the curly mullet, the one hand, the glove on one hand, the jacket with the sleeves rolled up, and of course the soundtrack. You got to have the all 80s soundtrack. And
Billy Idol on the airplane.
Yeah, literally meets Billy Idol on the airplane. Back when you can, and that was so soon after the 80s, you kind of could get away with it. It was only. Yeah. It was only 8 years after the fact. And he was completely right. Within the next 4 or 5 years, you're starting to see the early part. It's starting to happen. We see Grand Theft Auto Vice City, where they make an entire video game based around like this sort of really overly cartoonized version of Miami Vice. And then again, they got the rights to use all the music for all the different. You could cycle through the radio stations, and it's just every category of music that you had back then. And then every year, starting in the early to mid 2000s, every year you just see more and more and more and more. And I think it really, people realized how dominant this was going to be. I think when things like Stranger Things, and followed immediately by Glow, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, both hit Netflix as original shows. And were both running concurrently. You had big movies coming out that were all, based in the 80s. Take Me Home Tonight. You had, again, I've already mentioned Wonder Woman 84 from last year. That one was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of an 80s, sort of snapshot. But nonetheless, it's still capitalizing on that same, nostalgia. Even movies that are less obvious in that way, like movies like Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2 and Thor Ragnarok in the MCU, they don't bill themselves as 80s flashbacks, but they really do have this like strong 80s feel.
The Nurgle shirt or the Nagel, the Nagel painted shirt.
It's this it's this sort of sense of it. And the 80s were a weird time too, because when you look at the actual things that got made in the 80s, I think this is where it really is exemplary as a decade, unlike so many others, in terms of its pop culture. It was insane. I mean, it was the things that they were making, the things that, people got away with doing. It's like you look back and you're almost like, how did we even survive? When the people in charge were just basically, I won't say asleep at the wheel, because I don't think you can fall asleep when you're on that much cocaine. But, it's like, what were they thinking? And it was just one thing after another.
Lawn darts and Rubik's Cubes.
Lawn darts, Rubik's Cubes.
Teddy Ruxpins.
The Latchkey Kids. I think there's like two perfect movies from the 80s that really kind of capture what was wrong in real life in the 80s, and that's The Breakfast Club and Adventures in Babysitting. And both of those movies, despite having, they're tonally so different. One is a very serious drama, the other one is just a wacky comedy. But the reason that the plot of both of movies exists, because these children functionally have no parents. In terms of like they're absent, and the plot works only because their parents are just entirely checked out. They're like, all right, we're gone, you're on your own, and these are teenagers, and the parents just essentially not there, don't care. And I think we lived that back then. Those of us that were coming up that back then, we were like, I can tell you, I can name times of my life where I'm in the 80s, and I was young in the 80s. I was born in 1980, but I remember being 7, 8 years old and being left by myself at the house.
Yeah.
Like functionally overnight. I went to sleep and my parents hadn't come home yet. It was just me, the VCR, and, a microwave dinner. And, luckily, nothing too terrible it ever happened.
Yeah.
And I never really thought twice about it until I was much older. And being a father myself, having a child myself, and I thought to myself, I would never in a million years leave an 8-year-old home alone, like for the entire night. That's bizarre. And yet for me, it was totally normal.
Yeah.
And I think and not just for me, I think the fact that all of these movies exist pointing this out.
Exactly. That it was a cultural phenomena.
Yeah. It's,
now, also just sort of maybe shift gears a little bit, but what other influences do you have besides the 80s?
Oh yeah. So other than that, I love classical mythology, Greek, Roman, Norse. I started getting into some researching for this project. I got into some Shinto, some reading up on some of the Vedic texts, for Hinduism. A lot of stuff that I was much less familiar with. Chinese mythology. Really fell in love with the idea of the Monkey Kings and Wukong. Egyptian mythology, and then, interestingly enough, it was the Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos that led me into the ancient Babylonian, ancient Sumerian, basically trying to go back. All right, what's older than Egypt? What are the oldest mythologies that we know of? And I basically went all the way back to this Proto-Indo, Middle Eastern, Indo-European sort of theorized origins of most modern mythologies, and got into
the origin of everything.
Yeah, it's some of our oldest ideas about mythology, theology, cosmology, that sort of thing. We've got basically it's like pre-monotheistic Middle Eastern religion, Canaanite, Sumerian, Babylonian, the pre-Hebrew stuff, where the modern context of God in the singular didn't exist, and it was God in the plural. And you had the wife of, you had El, the god of the host, El Asherah, the wife of God, and then all the other ones, down in that pantheon. And I just get really interested in that and how similar it actually is. Some of the really old mythologies, that's kind of where I see Lovecraft getting some of his ideas. They're very, as I would describe a lot of that mythology as Lovecraftian, especially when you see the descriptions of these sort of demonic entities.
Very parallel.
Yes, I mean and Greek mythology especially. I mean the Gorgons. You almost can't get much more Lovecraftian than the Gorgons. I mean
that's true.
It's very Lovecraftian. And then you've got like the really big stuff. And the sort of older Sumerian demonology, you got Azazel and all this stuff. I think it's really fascinating how there is this sort of anxiety of influence over all of these things. You can see this idea of these other realms. And of course and the interesting thing is that bled through into the 80s pop culture too. I mean, you've got several adaptations of Lovecraft in the 80s. You've got, interestingly enough, it's not widely known. I mean, Lovecraft fans surely know this, but the Friday the 13th franchise is considered Lovecraftian. Jason Voorhees is considered, a sort of Lovecraftian entity. And then, likewise, the Evil Dead franchise is considered a part of that mythos as well. But yeah, it's
something else is that right at the end of the 70s and sort of carried on to the 80s was the first English mass-produced Lovecraft books and editions. Before then, you pretty much had to go through Arkham House. But when, Tor and Del Rey said, well, wait a minute, maybe Darla's copyright isn't as high, as tight as he thinks it is, and they started mass producing, that sort of leads it into the 80s to be the first real, a renaissance since, the 20s and the 30s.
Yep. I think, I wasn't aware of that, that legal particulars of the publishing part, but it makes total sense that happens though.
And one other thing happened in the 80s that I think really shot the mythos into where it is the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game.
Yes, definitely so. That hit, that was a big deal. And of course, and role-playing games themselves got huge in the 80s. Dungeons and Dragons, and then all of that kind of just piggybacked off each other and built, I think, sort of a culture around that idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, definitely.
But yeah, I remember Call of Cthulhu, the game. I think that's actually, it was around that time that I would have first heard that name, Cthulhu, and looked up the concept of what that was. And of course, immediately, oh, that sounds awesome. It's like Godzilla, but even weirder, you know.
Yeah.
Like as a kid, thinking that was my thought process behind that. But yeah.
So, sort of maybe jumping in time again, what do you think maybe in the 2050s, you think maybe, 30 years from now, what do you think they're going to think about us in the early 2020s?
Yeah, I think, projecting out into the future, for one, I think if the pattern I've observed of decades coming into fashion in terms of nostalgia, then I think the next big decade, it looks like it goes 30 years, right? 20s, 50s, 80s. That's consistently 30-year gaps.
Yeah.
So it'll actually, I think, be the 20-teens that, if that 30-year gap holds true. And I think that's not that far-fetched. Like, look at everything that happened, especially in the last 5 years of the 20-teens. I mean, crazy stuff in terms of history, in terms of politics, all that stuff going on. And it all culminates in 21 with that stuff.
Sure. But, you're right. It's almost, looking back, the 2010s is almost innocent.
Yeah.
If that makes sense compared to today.
It does feel like that. And in some ways, I think the early 2010s, people may look back on those as the calm before the storm.
Yeah.
Which in some ways you can say that's true of the 80s too, that was right before the internet hit. That was the 80s was the last time, it was the last of the analog. And then after that, everything went digital, everything downloaded, everything went cyber. And maybe that's going to be true of the teens right until 2020 is that was the end of everything right before everything started to go, quote, crazy. And we'll see if things calm down in the next few years. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I also think
nobody knows what the future is going to.
Yeah. I do think in 20, 30 years, they will look back on this time as definitely, it was volatile. It was, raucous. It was unwieldy. And then what they'll make of that, I don't know. We look back, the second half of the 20th century, we think of the Cold War, where it was us versus this sort of faceless other. Whereas now the Cold War seems to be happening here domestically, within the borders. There's a sort of a different version of a Cold War, I think. So that might be something that comes into play as well. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to look too far into the future, but of course, then again, at the same time, like as a sci-fi, person, it's definitely a hobby of mine. Like, what will the future be like, and what will they think of us now?
I'm almost always wrong guessing the future, and believe me, some of my guesses, it's good that I was wrong.
Yeah, that's true too. I tend to be oddly more optimistic than I think most people would expect. It's definitely than they would expect of someone that kind of dabbles in sci-fi, but I just, and maybe I'm completely naive here, but I always sort of think, I think things are going to be kind of okay. Like, sure, there'll be bumps, there'll be some pushback, but I think ultimately, overall, things will skew toward the positive. And I say that just because I think for the most part, other than a few hiccups in history, knock on wood, so far that has kind of held to be true.
We got this far.
Yeah. It's almost, people say, if you could go back to living any time before now, and I always think, no, I don't think I would. The best parts of the past exist for us to consume right now. I can watch the movies, I can listen to the music, I can re-experience the culture. I don't want to go back to a time where if I have a flat tire, I'm stranded. I don't want to go back to a time where certain people don't have rights.
Pre-vaccines and polio and.
Yeah, I mean, especially talking about going like way back. Yeah, it's like we'll go back to the Middle Ages. No thanks. No thanks.
Maybe a quick visit, but not forever.
So yeah, I think I am oddly optimistic. And every time some big new technology is announced, and everyone immediately clutches their pearls, and they're like, "This is we've gone to in the classic sci-fi ominous foreboding, we've gone too far." And I always think, nah, this is going to be fine. This will be okay. This will be cool. This will be fun. I'm going to buy one.
Well,
give me the smartwatch to check my heart rate. Yeah, I'll do it.
Well, I have loved having you as a guest, but we're almost out of time. But this is sort of the show's classic closing question. If you could be put in charge of any creative project, any medium, copyrights aren't an issue, money isn't an issue, what would it be?
What's funny is that's basically the question at hanging out at a bar one night, drinking with friends, that led to me creating this book trilogy, my 80s book trilogy, the Sledgehammer trilogy. Is I thought to myself, this is exactly how it started out. I promise you, this is how it started. I said I would remake The Last Starfighter and Pretty in Pink. My friends was like, well, no, you can only do one thing. I was like, no. It would only be one movie. I would just remake both things simultaneously as one movie. And I thought, I was like, because in the original Last Starfighter, Alex Rogan goes off to space and they leave a robot decoy of him at home that looks just like him, and a very cheap special effect, it's just him. And and I thought to every time I rewatch that film, and a lot of people have said they should remake it because the special effects aren't that great or whatever. And I've always thought if they ever remade that, I think the better half of the story is the robot copy trying to go through the motions of pretending to be a human being. Of course, we've seen a million versions of that. But I thought, let's, and that was where the Pretty in Pink came in. I was like, what I would do is if I'm going to write this 80s nostalgia, first of all, I'd set it back in the 80s, just like, it was originally, both of them. I would gender switch the main character. And that's where I came up with the name of my protagonist is I just took, two iconic 80s names, and I got Molly and Slater. Molly Slater is the protagonist.
Okay.
And that was the original concept. It was a split narrative of one's off in space, the other one is this robot is going through the motions of, trying to get a dress for prom and navigating like which guy to go on a date with, because quote she doesn't know, and the best friend character like figures out that it's not really her, but then helps her, anyway, like, oh, well, I'll help you, figure out how to be Molly, right? And then I started adding more into it. I was like, never mind just the two movies. I'm going to throw in some Eddie and the Cruisers and some Flash Gordon in there too. And then before long, it wasn't just two movies. It was 10, it was 20, it was 30. And I had
an entire franchise.
Yeah. And then by the time I got ready to write the book, I just completely scrapped the Last Starfighter angle and went in more of a She-Ra direction. But I always kind of I always wanted that sort of grounded, but they're real. The thing they keep coming back to is prom and trying to get a band together, and we can't find a drummer. And, while there's actual alien monsters invading, their reality from another dimension. And they're like, yeah, okay, we'll go fight them. But then back to band practice. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it all started. So,
it sounds like you're doing your dream project.
In some ways, yeah. I guess if I was going to do it in a different medium, though, what I would want is an animated version of the idea, and then before it's too late, like a Netflix style animation, like the recent Castlevania and Masters of the Universe re-ups, the way they've done that style. I like that art style, but if they did something like this, within the next few years, that way you could actually get everybody from the 80s that's still alive to come back and do the voices.
Yeah, at least do the voices.
You get Annie Potts back. You get, like I said, any certain Molly's, any certain Helen, that sort of thing. Andrew McCarthy, that guy's still around.
Christian Slater is in their new Inside Job.
Yep, that's true. So yeah, I mean, Elvira. I would have to involve Elvira.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, she's practically a deity of the '80s at this point.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to have you on. I apologize, we're almost running out of time, so I'd love to have you on again as soon as possible. But real quickly for my audience, where can they get your stuff? Where can we'll leave some show notes, but where are some places that they can get your existing stuff and your new book that's about to come out?
All right, yeah. So my new trilogy, books 1 and 2, are already out, so they're available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any major book outlet, book retailer. You can order it.
Look under Jason Stewart.
Yes, Jason Stewart. The first book is Jukebox Hero. That is book 1 of Sledgehammer, a rock and roll fable. That's the series title. And Jukebox Hero book 1 is also available in audiobook. So the first of those has been produced as an audiobook. The second and third, commissioned, we'll have those out later. That's a process that takes a little bit of time, but
sure.
Yeah, books 1 and 2. Book 2, Hungry Like the Wolf, is already out. That came out September 30th. And then the third book will release to Kindle and paperback on Amazon and other retailers December 21st. So the whole trilogy will complete this year by Christmas.
Right before Christmas.
Yep.
Excellent. And we will definitely make sure that we have some links. But again, thank you so much. And I hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I loved it.
Great interview. Thank you.
Hey everyone, we are back.
That was a quick break.
I know it was a quick break. I mean, it was a good interview.
And we had an interview too.
Yeah. One thing I had to say before we get quite into the Conan talk is I had some coffee today from one of our sponsors. This is so not even Conan or D&D related. It was a lavender coffee I had from Vietnamese coffee from Copper Cow, and it was really good. I mean, if I was playing a LARP, I would definitely treat this like for mana or a health potion, because it definitely picked me up and got me moving. And
and lavender.
Yeah. It picked me up, but also calmed me down. It's kind of a weird sensation. So it's like, hey, this is a really good pour over. Yeah, that picks me up and chills me up. Anyway,
you know what I put lavender in?
What's that?
Lemonade.
Lemonade. That sounds really good. Do you know what Conan puts lavender in?
The mouths of his enemies?
I was going to say the skulls of his enemies. But yeah, Conan in your RPG, whether it be D&D or some sort of GURPS type percentile game, or some sort of BRP, sword and sandal, I don't know, Cthulhu kind of game. Yeah.
So I have a Conan story.
Sure, go for it.
I have a Conan story, and we kind of fictionalized this with Radio Free Oleander.
Yeah.
But when I was after. So we'll go a little bit of history of the role-playing games of Conan.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the first ones was that there were AD&D titles tied into Conan the Destroyer.
Sure.
And Red Sonja.
Yeah.
And one of the guys in this group, my group back then, he bought the Red Sonja one, and he knew nothing. I don't think he saw the movie, but I hadn't either. I think he knew nothing about the comic book character, and so he basically takes this, he throws it in front of me, and then says, "You're going to run this for me. We're going to one shot or one person." And okay, that's cool, fine. We're going to play anyways, and you're buying the scenarios. Okay, we'll do it. And that's the first time I actually read it. I mean, I'd seen the ads for Red Sonja.
Yeah.
But the little part there at the beginning was kind of the first time I really learned about who Red Sonja was.
Yeah.
And that it was a Robert E. Howard character from, Valley of the Vultures. So we're reading it, and then I got it. And then I explained this part to him that Red Sonja had this vow of chastity.
Uh-huh.
And his face just fell. And he goes, "Well, that ruins my plans."
Gross.
It was still good.
Yeah.
It was still a good adventure.
Cool.
But so those were probably the first. But about the same time, the first role-playing game, GURPS, Conan. And they did a GURPS Conan, which if it was out there, is like one of the most expensive GURPS supplements. They didn't make a lot of them.
Yeah.
And then they did one book, which basically I think it was like during the Pickish areas, based on Black River short stories. So that was the first D&D. And then when we get into 3E, there are two, and one by Mongoose, and I'm not sure the other one, but there's, during that period, two different companies do Open 20 license. Now, like I said, recently, within the last couple of months, the trademark, and you notice we don't use the word copyright.
Yeah.
The stories, so copywritten stories almost are all, the copyright's expired. So if I wanted to, write Red Nails, word for word, credit to Robert E. Howard, I could publish it, make money. What I can't do, though, what does not expire, is the trademark. Conan, like Batman and Superman, are trademark characters. So I can't write new Conan stories and publish it and expect to get any money off of it. So Modifius now, and who knows in the next 2 months, or after the last 2 months, held the right to the role-playing game in their 2D20 system.
Okay.
And that is, I think, the best, even better than, say, GURPS, which you can pretty much personalize. That is the best capturing the spirit of Conan.
Okay.
And so there's definitely got things where, you can even do almost like signature moves, like do mental damage to your enemy by showing him the heads of their leaders and things. But they're written by, that's labor of love. Yeah. As well as some very big name Howard scholars are involved in it. So here's my first advice. If you're going to do a Conan, get the Modifius game. It's worth it.
All right.
And it's also, compared to Modifius games goes, it's also usually about $5 or $10 cheaper than some of their other 2D20 games.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have one last tag for this, and we're not getting paid for it, but
sure.
Modifius, if you want, give us some money and we'll take it. It's almost, you can go online, there's character generators. You almost cannot create a bad character with that system.
Interesting. Good to
Even
know.
just using the random or whatever you want, it is almost impossible to create a bad character.
Good to know. Good to know. Oh, and I just want to take this moment. Hey, if anyone wants to donate money to our PayPal or join us on Patreon or anything like that, some of that money goes to Dave so that Dave can buy RPGs. Just, help out Dave and his RPG collection / addiction.
You wrote to see my little puppy dog eyes. You can't see my puppy dog eyes over the podcast. But yeah, no, I would say, there's definitely things that you can do Conan eyes your campaigns.
Yeah.
But if you want a truly Conan, go with the Modiphius scheme.
Okay. All right. Yeah. What would you say if you wanted to Conanize your game? Not just not, it's like if you wanted to take it from Dungeons and Dragons or Lord of the Rings, it's like, hey, I normally play Arthurian fantasy, medieval fantasy, heavy, just kind of like dark fantasy. That it's like, how do I get into how do I make it more Conan-y? What makes it more Conan-y?
So I think a Conan-y enemy. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to use, for an example, I'm going to use the movie.
Okay.
Bethesda Doom. He's this huge, larger-than-life villain, but he's not in Conan's face all the time.
Yeah.
He's got agents. He's got powers. So I think one of the things is to focus, make the bad guy there, but not there, and have him have agents, have the cultists do it in the bad guy's name, and then I would suggest being maybe sparing with magic. Obviously magic's a big part of the Conan adventure, but it's not necessarily fireballs. And that's going to be hard to take away because people want that. Crom is not until like a much later, like the camp story that we really see Crom is real.
Yeah.
And so I would make it more mysterious, magic, rare. And the other thing is, I would use scenery porn.
Yeah.
Howard gave Conan this entire continent, from these high mountains that go down to this ocean and the boat ride and then the desert and then back up into like middle Europe. As I would definitely play up the scenery.
Yeah.
The way that people look. And I would give, Conan is very heroic. He's this kind of he's a neutral character.
Yeah.
I would definitely say he's neutral, but he always ends up doing the heroic. He's almost maybe even neutral chaotic.
Yeah.
But maybe more neutral selfish. Neutral selfish. But he ends up, he's got this own sort of code. So I would say he's more neutral than neutral chaotic.
Yeah.
But he ends up fighting these things that are worse than him. And so I think that's definitely, and we think of he's the barbarian, but he's also the pirate. He's the mercenary.
Yeah.
He's of the king. What are some of the things that you would do to sort of do a Conan?
Okay, so what I wanted to talk about was more how to use Conan in your game, or a Conan type character. So and also I kind of wanted to say it's not just a Conan type character, but maybe also kind of like a Mad Max kind of character, like your chaotic, neutral outsider who comes from a place from outside from where you are, who travels through, comes into your life, has their own epic story that you may have heard bits and pieces of, that when you first meet them, when you're first put in jail with this, drunk mountain of muscle who, you break out and they follow you and they, help you escape. It's not until like maybe 7 adventures later you find out that the mercenary that you run into again, and you're like, oh, hey, you're that drunk guy, that someone says, do you know who that is? That's Conan the pirate. That's Conan the mercenary, or something like that. Or, it's like you hear about this person and then you keep bumping into this person and you don't realize who it is. It's just like, oh, hey, it's that mercenary guy. It's that fighter guy. Oh, cool. Fighter guy. Cool. And then it's not until like much later, much further, it's like maybe you're thrown into an arena together and it's like, your character, Conan the Barbarian, blah, and you're like, oh shit. And then you realize, oh, I know this guy. This guy's cool. I've had drinks with this guy. That
he's a friend from work.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, this is another adventurer. This guy doesn't want to be here either. Let's figure out something and get the hell out of here. I got a jewel to steal. It's like if your character's a thief and a magic user or something like that. It's like, hey, you bump into this fighter from time to time. Conan can become your Deus Ex Machina, but Conan can also be kind of like your person to say, oh yeah, no, I've been from this place, and if you go here and here, you're going to find this stuff. I mean, Conan can be a contact. Conan can be like your hired muscle. In some aspects, Conan can be your face, your charismatic person. If you don't have that, you have a huge barbarian, you have this big, huge fighter guy that, can use Intimidate to maybe help you get some information if you can't. I mean, Conan is a Swiss Army knife for adventures and stories. Conan has it's kind of like early Superman. If Superman needs early Superman, it's like Superman stories. If Superman needs to know how to do something, Superman knows how to do it. Or, in Conan's case, Conan may not know how to do it right away, but by the end of the story, Conan will know how to do it.
and you definitely want to still keep. It's a thin line. Mm-hmm. You want to keep the story still about the character.
Sure.
And I think especially, and you're right, Conan is the king, the thief, the freebooter, the mercenary, the brigand.
Yeah.
He's all these things. He's not just the barbarian.
Yeah.
But it might be let's say you've got a whole team and everybody wants to play the support character. Mm-hmm. And the likelihood of everybody wanting, maybe a group does, everybody wants to be, the cleric, the thief. No one wants to be the battle, the big, kill hobo.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say you could have a campaign around that. It's like, hey, you've been hired by this king to follow around this kill hobo who he's hired to take care of this person. But, the king also knows for a fact that you can't just send one, pile of muscle with a big sword in a single direction, expect them to come back. So maybe make sure he gets there safe, Ranger, get everyone there safe. Cleric, heal everyone. Rogue, I don't know.
but no, so yeah, maybe you've got characters that to them, that stress of making that dice challenge for picking the lock. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the thing they like.
Yeah.
And maybe, and if you're going to do that, and of course there's going to be combat. Everybody's going to get combat eventually. But, even, your murder hobos, out there murdering hobos, but your thief character has 5 turns to get 3 successful lockpicks.
Yeah.
And maybe you've got characters that like that, especially, let's say you've got 2 characters, and they don't want to necessarily be the big combatants, and you have maybe a larger life character, and let them do the support stuff. Maybe be the face stuff, be the lockpick stuff.
Yeah. And if you have them do the support stuff, definitely make the combat stuff very cinematic around them. While it's like, okay, you've got 2 more rounds to get this lock before the trap goes, or before the cultists overrun your fighter, probably, and in all likelihood your fighter is going to be down in another round unless you get this door open. You can definitely add the spice, add the heat, add the pressure.
Or make it a shared character instead of making an NPC. You got 4 characters, and you break your adventure into 4 times. You play your character, but the character 1 gets to play the Conan, the first part, and then you get the second part. It rotates around, so it's not just an NPC. It's a shared character.
Oh, yeah.
And that way you could maybe justify having it if you're doing a D20. It's a higher level character. Well, yes, it is, but everybody gets to use it.
Gotcha.
Or maybe not even break the adventure into quarters. Or just keep rotating it for, combat turn.
Yeah. I like that.
And then you might end up with a very schizophrenic character that doesn't do all the things at the same time.
Or you might end up with what a lot of us have ended up with in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. You have someone who's playing a barbarian, and they're like, "What do I do next?" And then the person who's playing the wizard, who's probably played a little bit more Dungeons and Dragons, possibly, is like, "You need to do this. You need to do this. You need to do this." And the dungeon master's like, "Hey, no outside help."
No, metagame.
So it turns into a big metagame that everyone's a part of.
Yeah. So that's so I think it's interesting is have your if you're gonna have a sort of a Conan character, let it be or let's say you've got 2 or 3 players, 1 character.
Yeah.
1 character, especially if you got 3. And I've never tried this. I don't know how this would work, but if anyone has, let us know. So you make this sort of, I don't want to say Mary Sue, but this pretty well-rounded character that can handle it by themselves. And, you got 3 people, you vote. You vote, what he's going to do. And then if it's 3-way tie, you either, go alphabetical order, you get first, or everybody does a roll off. Whoever gets highest gets to decide that turn.
Oh, wow.
You have to have people that can work together.
Yeah.
That could almost come into real life. But yeah, if you're going to do a Conan, and the other thing is a Conan, if you're doing just 1 character, start them off 10th level.
Yeah. And, make sure that there's someone who knows what to do with a 10th level character.
Yeah.
All right.
Or 2, if you got 1 or 2, start them off with these sort of highly experienced characters.
Yeah, I like that. All right. Anything else on Conan that you can think of, Dave?
Well, I think that's it. But like I said, now if you are interested in trying out the Modiphius, there are a couple of, and I don't know, like I said, I don't know if things are going to change with copyright, but you can get sort of like a basic starter set and a couple of free adventures for free.
Cool.
On Drive-Thru RPG.
All right.
So it's definitely worth checking out. I would also, someone who has been a guest on this show before, Seth Shakowski, does some really good videos on the Conan RPG and some of the adventures.
Nice. All right. Well, next episode, I know we're talking about The Color Out of Space and a city that Clark Ashton Smith wrote about. That it's an ancient capital city that everyone abandoned for some reason. We'll be talking about that. So,
and it's not Sarnak.
It is not Sarnak, no. But yeah, remember, check out the show notes. Find out where our guests can be found. Remember to rate, review, subscribe. Check out our sponsors. And Dave, any other final words before we head off into that dark night?
Just as we get closer to the holidays, we'll have a happy holidays.
Yeah, everyone have a happy holidays. And I hope you're having a good commute, a safe trip, or wrapping presents for whatever reason, doing whatever you're doing. Happy holidays, and we'll see you next week.
Or will we?
Ooh.